Cleaning up battlegrounds. If the war in Ukraine stops tomorrow morning, it stops tomorrow morning. The biggest problem is what's left on the battleground. Cluster bombs dropped by the United States, cluster bombs dropped by Russia all over Ukraine. There are farmers' fields that won't dare farm in their fields because of cluster bombs. What's a cluster bomb? Let's say there's 100 small bomblets that don't go off until you step on them, or you run it over with a tractor. Yes. And all over Ukraine, farmers' fields and villages have had cluster bombs dropped on them by Russia. They have to be disarmed. Russia, when they took Mariupol, had the civilians out there under Russian eye, of course, but the civilians were there cleaning up the countryside, the buildings, removing chemicals, removing everything, and a workforce. Russian soldiers were there not to work, but to have civilians do the work. The cluster bombs that were there were, well, you have workers to worry about, and people got killed. Russians didn't get killed. Anything. Now the Russians did have their bomb squads in there, but overall, the civilians took that thing. Whole areas are uninhabitable because of cluster bombs being dropped. Now, when the Ukrainians do that, they drop it along the Russian line, no man's land. They just drop them. The Russians drop the cluster bombs in there too. So whatever happens, let's say Russians withdraw to post-2010 lines. Somebody's going to clean it up. And all over Europe, people are being trained to bomb disposal. Even the Chinese said they will bring people in there for bomb disposal because the Chinese are very good at building things up. Yeah. Oh yeah. They're very good, diligent workers. One thing you can say about a Russian. What else? Something goes back to the Continental Railroad. The Chinese started on the west side, the Irish started on the east side, and they met in between. The Chinese basically did it. They drilled, they blasted, they had a workforce, construction boss. They went in there and they did through some of the worst conditions you could ever conceive, but they met up. It's like, oh, little androids running around, but they met up. They had, when the Chinese landed in the United States to work on the railroad, they had their section crews and everything else. Who's going to do this, that, and whatever. So, but they're very efficient at building things. You saw them in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca. The bosses in there were Chinese bosses. But those were all infidels. Yes, they were, weren't they? They got the stuff done. So cleaning up is going to be a job, an expensive job.